Voicemail came in at 20:47 in the morning. I know the exact time because I'd been awake anyway, running equipment checks in the motor pool at Fort Bragg, and my phone buzzed against my thigh 3 times before I pulled it out. Montana area code. My aunt's number. I almost didn't listen to her right then. We were shipping out in 6 days, and I had a clipboard full of things that needed to happen before dawn. But something made me step away from the vehicle bay, walk out into the cold air, and press play. It wasn't my aunt's voice. It was my mother's. She was whispering. That's the part that hit me first. Not what she was saying, but the fact that she was whispering in her own house at 2 in the morning. Sweetheart, I don't want to worry you. But something's wrong. Kevin's been talking to someone at the bank. I heard him on the phone in the garage and he didn't know I was awake. He said something about the deed. He said my name and then he laughed. I don't know what to do. I don't want to cause trouble. I love you, baby. I'm sorry to bother you. The message ended. I stood in the parking lot for probably 45 seconds, just standing there with the phone against my ear listening to silence. Then I called her back. It rang 8 times. No answer. I called my aunt. She picked up on the second ring, already awake, already worried, because she'd gotten the same voicemail 2 hours earlier and had been sitting in her kitchen in Billings ever since, trying to decide what to do. She won't let me come over, my aunt said. She says Kevin will get upset. That sentence? I've thought about it 1,000 times since. Kevin will get upset. My mother was 61 years old, recovering from her second round of chemotherapy, living alone on the property my grandfather built with his own hands, and her first instinct when something frightened her was to worry about upsetting her husband of 14 months. I'll back up. My mother is the strongest person I've ever known. I don't say that the way people say it about someone who's had a hard life and kept smiling. I mean she is operationally, functionally, genuinely tough. She raised me alone after my father died when I was 9. She worked 2 jobs, kept our cattle operation running on 30 acres outside of Whitefish, Montana, and never once asked anyone for anything she couldn't eventually give back. When she got her first cancer diagnosis, breast stage 2, she told me on a Sunday evening, cried for exactly 1 dinner's worth of time, and by Monday morning had already mapped out her treatment schedule around calving season. She met Kevin Strath at a church fundraiser when I was deployed to Syria. My aunt told me about him in pieces over several calls. He was charming, he was attentive, he had a nice truck, he seemed to genuinely care about her. By the time I got stateside and met him in person, they'd been together 8 months, and he was already halfway moved in. I didn't like him. I want to be honest about that. But I also knew I'd spent 3 years watching my mother be lonely, and I wasn't going to be the son who showed up and poisoned the one good thing she had because of a gut feeling I couldn't articulate. He was polite to me. He shook my hand with both of his. He called me son, and I let it go. They got married the following spring. Small ceremony. My mother wore her grandmother's earrings. I shipped up again 4 months later, and somewhere in those months, I wasn't home. Kevin Strath became a different person. Or maybe he was always that person. Maybe he was just done waiting. I found out later, piecing it together from documents and conversations, that he'd started making calls about the property almost immediately after the wedding. My grandfather's land had been passed to my mother free and clear, no mortgage, no liens. 40 acres of the most valuable ranch land in Flathead County, with a creek running through the south end and timber rights my grandfather had held on to through 3 recessions. Conservative estimate, somewhere north of $800,000. Kevin had a brother in Spokane who did real estate. Kevin had a line of credit he'd never mentioned. Kevin had a plan. The whispering voicemail was my mother figuring that out 7 months too late. I went to my commanding officer at 6 that morning. Captain Reyes. She listened to everything I said without interrupting, which is one of the things I respect most about her. When I finished, she looked at me for a moment and said, "How long do you need?" 2 weeks, I said. Maybe less. She nodded once. Family emergency leave. Get your affairs in order and go. I drove 31 hours straight. I've done harder things physically, but I can't think of many that tested my discipline more than that drive. Knowing what I was going toward, and having to stay at the speed limit anyway. Having to stop for gas and coffee and act like a normal person on a normal highway. I pulled into my mother's driveway at 11 at night. She opened the door before I could knock. She'd lost weight since Christmas. Not dramatically, but enough that I noticed it in the way her collar hung. She hugged me for a long time without saying anything. I could feel her holding herself very still, the way people do when they're trying not to cry. Kevin wasn't there. He'd gone to Spokane, she said, to see his brother. We sat at the kitchen table with coffee, and she told me everything. It came out slowly at first, then faster, like she'd been holding it in a container that was already cracked, and my being there finally let it split open. Kevin had been on the phone constantly for the past 2 months. He'd started going through her filing cabinet. She'd found things moved, folders out of order. He'd mentioned, casually, that it might make sense to put both their names on the property deed for estate planning purposes. She'd agreed to look into it because it sounded reasonable, because he made everything sound reasonable. Then she'd overheard that phone call. "What exactly did he say?" I asked. She wrapped her hands around her mug. "He said she'll sign it. I've got her where I need her." And then he laughed. She looked at me. "I think I've been very stupid, sweetheart." "No," I said. "You trusted someone. That's not stupid." "No," I said. "You trusted someone. That's not stupid. That's what decent people do." But I was already thinking about everything I needed to do before Kevin came back from Spokane. The first thing I did was drive to see my mother's attorney. Her name was Margaret Osei. She'd been in Whitefish for 30 years, and she had the calm, precise manner of someone who has seen every variety of human bad behavior and stopped being surprised by any of it. I sat across from her desk and explained the situation in 10 minutes. She listened, asked 4 questions, and said, "You did the right thing coming to me first." She pulled my mother's file. The deed was still clean, my mother's name only. Whatever Kevin had been planning, he hadn't executed it yet. But Margaret found something else. My mother had a will. She'd had it since I was 12, updated after my grandfather died. It left everything to me, with a modest amount set aside for her sister. Standard, sensible, exactly what you'd expect. 3 weeks earlier, a document had been filed with a notary in Kalispell modifying that will. The modification added Kevin Strath as primary beneficiary. My mother had not signed it. I know this with certainty because when Margaret showed it to me, I photographed it, took it to a handwriting analyst in Missoula the next day, and had a written expert opinion in my hand 48 hours later. The signature was a deliberate forgery. Someone had practiced it. You could see the slight hesitation in the downstroke of the C in her first name, the way someone pauses when they're copying rather than writing naturally. I also know it in the way that sits below evidence and expertise, because my mother looked at that document and started shaking. "I never signed this," she said. Her voice was very quiet. "I've never seen this in my life." Kevin came back from Spokane on a Thursday afternoon. I was sitting in the living room when his truck came up the driveway. He walked in and saw me, and his face did something interesting. It took about a quarter of a second. This flicker of calculation running behind his eyes before the smile arrived. He had a good smile. I'll give him that. He deployed it like a tool. "Marcus," he said. He called me by my brother's name the first time. "I don't have a brother." "It's Miles," I said. "Miles, of course." The smile didn't waver. "Didn't know you were coming home. Your mom didn't mention it." "She didn't know," I said. "Neither did you." That was deliberate. He laughed, easy and relaxed, and set his keys on the counter. "Well, it's good to see you. You boys hungry?" "I was thinking I'd do steaks tonight." "Sit down, Kevin." Something shifted. Not dramatically. He didn't flinch, didn't step back, but the ease went out of his posture, replaced by something more careful. He sat down at the kitchen table. I put the document in front of him. I didn't say anything. I've learned, over the years, that silence is more effective than most things. People will sit quietly for about 4 seconds before the discomfort becomes unbearable and they start talking to fill it. Kevin lasted 6 seconds. That told me something. "What's this?" he said. "You know what it is?" I said. "I've never seen this document." "The notary in Kalispell has your name on the appointment record," I said. "We already called them." That was true. Margaret had confirmed it. His jaw moved. I was helping her. She wanted to update her estate planning, and she wasn't feeling well enough to drive, so She didn't sign it. I said. "She signed it." She didn't. I slid a second document across the table. The handwriting analysis. A forensic document examiner in Missoula spent 18 hours on this signature. Want to read his conclusions? Kevin looked at the report. He looked at it for a long time. "I want to call my lawyer," he said. "That's your right," I said. "You should know that while you make that call, my mother's attorney is filing a fraud complaint with the Flathead County Sheriff's Office. The forensic report goes with it. So does the recording." He looks up. "What recording?" My mother had one of those small voice-activated recorders, the kind people use for grocery lists and reminders. She'd started keeping it in her cardigan pocket 2 weeks before I arrived, on the advice of my aunt, who'd gotten the idea from a true crime podcast. She'd been carrying it every day without telling Kevin. She'd been carrying it the morning Kevin sat down with her and walked her through a stack of estate documents and pointed to lines and said, "Just sign here and here and here, hon. This is just housekeeping. Your lawyer already looked at these." Her lawyer had looked at nothing, but the recorder had captured every word. Kevin's lawyer drove up from Missoula. He was competent, professional, and visibly unhappy when he reviewed the evidence we had assembled. He and Margaret Osei had a 90-minute conversation that I was not present for, but I could see through the window of my mother's sunroom that it didn't go well for his client. Kevin's brother's real estate scheme, and there was a scheme, Margaret confirmed it once the financial forensics came back, involved 3 separate steps. The will modification, a plan to refinance the property using my mother's name while she was still in cancer treatment and perhaps less attentive to paperwork, and a quiet agreement with the developer in Kalispell who had wanted that land for a resort project for 7 years. Kevin's brother stood to make a significant finder's fee. Kevin stood to walk away with the house, the land, and whatever remained of my mother's savings after the medical bills. The whole plan depended on my mother being isolated, tired, and compliant. She'd been 2 of those 3 things. She'd never been the 3rd. Kevin left that same evening. He took his clothes, his gun safe, and the expensive coffee maker he'd brought when he moved in. He did not take the vehicle he'd been driving for the last 8 months. It was my mother's truck, which she'd let him use, and he apparently didn't realize until he was loading that his name wasn't on the title. She stood on the porch and watched him load his things into his brother's car without saying a word. I stood next to her. When they drove away, she exhaled slowly, like someone who'd been holding their breath for a very long time. "I'm sorry," she said. "You didn't do anything wrong," I said. "I should have called you sooner." "You called me," I said. "That's all that matters." She leaned against my arm. We stood there until the truck's headlights disappeared around the bend in the driveway. The fraud charge was filed. The sheriff's office opened an investigation. The will modification was voided by a judge in Kalispell who took 20 minutes to review the case and didn't seem to find it a close call. Margaret filed a civil suit against both Kevin and his brother for attempted property fraud and conspiracy. Their attorney made settlement noises within 3 weeks. Kevin's draft did not go to prison. I want to be straight with you about that. The criminal case was complicated. Proving intent in financial crimes takes time, and Kevin's attorney was skilled enough to create enough ambiguity that the DA made a calculation. He pleaded to a misdemeanor. He paid restitution. He got probation. His brother lost his real estate license. The developer in Kalispell, who'd had his hands clean enough that no charges stuck, at least had to find a different piece of land. And Kevin has to live knowing that the scheme he spent over a year building collapsed in 72 hours because a 61-year-old woman with cancer put a $20 voice recorder in her cardigan pocket and pressed the little red button. I'm not going to pretend I'm entirely at peace with how that ended. There were moments in those first few days when I was sitting across the table from him, watching him smile, watching him calculate, where I felt something that had nothing to do with legal strategy or forensic documents or civil suits. I knew exactly what he tried to do to a woman who was already fighting her body every single day. I knew she'd been alone in that house, scared enough to whisper in her own kitchen, and he'd been the reason. So no, I don't have perfect peace with the outcome. But I watched my mother walk back into her house that evening. I watched her fill the coffee maker with water and find her favorite mug in the cabinet and stand at her kitchen window looking out at the creek running through the south end of her property. Her name, her land that her father built. And I watched something come back into her posture. Something upright and settled that I hadn't seen since Christmas. She looked over at me and said, "You hungry? I've got elk in the freezer." That's my mother. One sentence from grief to practical. "Yeah," I said, "I'm starving." I ate at that table until I was full for the first time in months. The creek made its sound outside. The Montana dark came down over everything. And my mother talked about the cattle, about the timber, about a pair of sandhill cranes that had started nesting near the south fence line, which had never happened before in her memory. She talked about the future like it belonged to her again. Because it did. Kevin Strath thought he'd found a sick woman alone on valuable land. A little overwhelmed and a little lonely. Someone whose defenses were down and whose son was far away. He thought he had time and proximity and charm on his side. What he didn't count on was that her son had been trained to walk into situations other people walk away from. He didn't count on a voice recorder. He didn't count on a 61-year-old woman who, even scared, even whispering, had enough presence of mind to press record first. And he didn't count on the fact that no matter how far away I am, I always come home. I went back to Fort Bragg 9 days later. Captain Reyes asked me how it went. I told her it was handled. She nodded and didn't ask anything else, which is why I trust her. My mother called me the following Sunday, like she does every Sunday. She told me the cranes had laid eggs. She told me the Flathead County agricultural assessor had been out about a tax matter and had admired her fence line which she'd rebuilt herself 3 summers ago. She told me her latest blood work had come back and her oncologist was cautiously optimistic. "How are you doing?" I asked. "Better than I've been in over a year," she said. And she sounded like it. The land is still hers. Every acre. The creek still runs through the south end. The cranes nested through the spring and both eggs hatched, which my mother told me about with the same tone she used to tell me about any other thing that had survived and made it through. Which, if you know her, is the highest praise she gives. I've thought a lot about what made Kevin think he could get away with it. He wasn't stupid. That's the part people miss when they hear a story like this. He wasn't some impulsive guy who made a bad decision in a bad moment. He was patient. He was deliberate. He spent over a year building the conditions he needed, the trust, the proximity, the timing. He waited until my mother was in treatment, until I was overseas, until she was tired enough and grateful enough for companionship that she might not look too closely at a stack of papers he slid across the table on a Tuesday morning. He did the math on her vulnerability and decided it added up in his favor. And that's the thing about people who operate that way. They're not wrong about the math. They're just wrong about one variable they didn't think to account for. My mother never stopped being herself. Even scared, even whispering in her own kitchen at 2 in the morning, she pressed record first. She called her sister. She left me a voicemail she wasn't sure I'd act on. That's not luck, that's character. That's decades of being a person who faces things, instead of waiting for someone else to face them for her. Kevin saw a sick woman alone on valuable land. He never actually looked at who she was. I think about what would have happened if she hadn't pressed that button. If she'd talked herself out of it, told herself she was being paranoid, told herself Kevin would be upset, told herself to wait and see. The will modification would have gone through. The refinancing would have gone through. The refinancing would have started. By the time the full picture became clear, she might not have had the energy left to fight it. One small act of courage, a $20 recorder in a cardigan pocket, changed the entire outcome. That's something I carry with me. Not the confrontation at the kitchen table, not the legal filings, not any of the things that feel like the climax of the story. It's that moment I'll never see. The moment she stood alone in her kitchen and made the decision to document what was happening to her, even though she was frightened and uncertain and had no idea whether it would matter. She did the hard thing before anyone was watching. That's the only kind of courage that actually counts. As for Kevin, I don't spend much time on him. He made his choices. He treated another person's life as a resource to extract value from. And when the extraction failed, he had nothing. No land, no money, no scheme, no marriage. Just a misdemeanor record and a brother who lost his license. That's not a punishment I designed. That's just what happens when you build something entirely on someone else's loss. There's nothing to fall back on when it collapses, because you never built anything real to begin with. My mother replanted her garden that spring. She sent me a photo of the south fence line with the crane nest visible in the corner of the frame. She looked healthy. She looked like herself. That's the whole story, really. She looked like herself again. That's what we were fighting for.